Welcome to the 7th meeting of our ongoing lecture series, examining 20th century German language literature's engagement with the diverse and often excluded dimensions of modern life. I am deeply honored to present our speaker today, Professor Kirk. Professor Wetters is a professor of German at Yale University, specializing in the intersections of modern literature and critical theory. His research examines the role of opinion in post-Enlightenment literature and theory, as explored in his first book, The Opinion System, Impasses of the Public Sphere from Hobbes to Habermas, published by Fordham University Press in 2008. His second monograph, Demonic History from Goethe to the Present, published by Northwestern University Press in 2014, traces the preoccupation with demons in modern literature and philosophy, focusing on figures like Goethe, Benjamin, and Lukács. Professor Wetters has also studied 20th century Austrian literature, the theories of Hans Blumenberg, and concepts of mass psychology and literary form. His current project, The Theory Show, explores the evolution of academic genre and the emergence of interdisciplinary research in post-war West Germany. Professor Wetters is currently a fellow at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. As you may recall, our lecture series sets out to explore how modern German language literature and culture not only reflect but also contest the dominant narratives of modernity. By focusing on texts that reconstruct alternative counter-hegemonic versions of modernity, the series seeks to illuminate the plurality and contradictions that underlie what is often perceived as a unified cultural and historical project. Professor Wetters' lecture, Intellectual Outsider, Karl Markus Michel and the Voice of Critique, turns our attention to a particularly provocative instance of such a counter-hegemonic narrative of modernity. This talk discusses the figure of the intellectual as an other of modernity, a counterintuitive and potentially controversial claim, especially against metahistorical narratives of progress and enlightenment, in which intellectuals are typically seen as indispensable. Drawing on traditions from Marx to Spivak, Professor Wetters' talk focuses on West Germany between 1945 and 1968, particularly on the largely forgotten figure of Karl Markus Michel, revisiting his contributions to Adorno's seminars and his essay, Die sprachlose Intelligenz, the Speechless Intelligentsia. The talk explores how intellectual production became marginalized in modern political systems. By exploring how a critical intellectual voice like Michel's was sidelined, this lecture embodies the series' broader aim to interrogate the mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion that define modernity. In examining the intellectual not as a privileged agent of modern progress, but as a silenced, marginalized figure, today's talk underscores the series' commitment to revealing the complexities and contradictions at the heart of modern cultural and political life. So thank you, Professor Wetters, for joining us today, and we look forward to your insights.
Thank you so much, Ariel and Amir. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the organization. Thanks for the invitation to be here. As I was saying before we started, speaking here today really accelerated my work on this project, which I hadn't had a lot of time to do up until just the last few weeks. So this is really just a kind of a first attempt at what I'm going to read today. I think I have actually written more than I'll have time for, but I'll attempt to stay within the very generous time frame that I was offered, 50 to 60 minutes for the talk. I'm starting with a disclaimer. When I proposed the topic back in November, in the days following Donald Trump's election, this project was something I intended to start working on as a possible book chapter. In the months that followed, I had essentially no time to actually work on it up to the past 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the topic itself, Die sprachlose Intelligenz, the Speechless Intelligentsia, which I had been thinking about primarily in academic contexts related to critique and post-critique, started to get uncomfortably real. What I will present today is only a first attempt to sort out and bring order to the primary materials I'm working with, most of which, with the exception of the Spivak text, I assume will not be familiar to many of you, or any of you, most likely. At the same time, the uncanny resemblances of 20th century debates to those of our time will, I hope, help to hold your interest and perhaps cast some indirect light on the dilemmas currently facing academia and critical thought in the broadest sense. So I didn't write a text for this slide, but it's a little bit of information on there about the book, Die sprachlose Intelligenz by Karl Markus Michel, which is from the middle of the 60s. It's generally considered to be fairly important, but it was never translated and not that often read. And I only myself heard about it within the last 2 or 3 years. It has been compared to important works of the period of the early and mid 60s, and in particular those books which are mentioned there, I think are interesting comparisons, or which are written about there on the slide are interesting comparison points. And I think with that, I'll just move ahead and start with the next part of the talk. This slide should have come earlier. Sorry, I was scrambling up to the very last minute, but you see the general outline. It's really the last 2 sections which are the longer and more substantive. The other ones are pretty short. So starting with a little bit of information about Karl Markus Michel, who's a name that some people know or have encountered, partly if they own the Surkamp Hegel edition, which he was a co-editor of. Then the name is sitting there on the bookshelf, but they don't always know that much more about him. And because I was aware that he's not a very well-known figure, I wanted to start with a very brief sketch, not of the full biography, but of the parts of the biography that are of most significance for me and for what I'm going to talk about today. So Michel was born in 1929. He was a university student in the 1950s, notably in Frankfurt in the circle around Adorno, but without completing a dissertation. From 1961 to 1970, he was a lector at the Surkamp Verlag, where he was, according to the recent book by Morten Powell, arguably the key figure for getting Surkamp's Theorie series off the ground. And also for Surkamp, he edited and contributed to the long-running journal Kurs. I can say something more about the title of that journal in the Q&A if somebody asks me about it. He also supervised the translation of key works of French theory into German. These activities contributed directly to the consolidation of Surkamp's brand. In Powell's account, Michel was the driving intellectual force behind the expansion of the small, left-leaning, mostly belletristic publishing house into the all-purpose juggernaut of academic and literary writings that it had effectively become already by the early 1970s. These developments, which Michel enabled, were also effectively the reason why he left Surkamp in 1970. Not an academic himself, but a kind of what you could call organic intellectual, or someone striving after that ideal. His career in literary and academic publishing made him an insider, and at the same time a distant observer of the material conditions, the business of disseminating ideas in the form of intellectual speech. Part 3. I'm going to read the quotes in English, but I give them to you also in German. Where does the cause of the failure and ineffectuality of this massive deployment of intelligentsia actually lie? And in the introduction, I'm going to cover all of these points in a series of short paragraphs. Speeches on the ineffectiveness of academic speech have a hard time being heard. Self-castigating or blame-hurling critiques of the ideological complicity of intellectuals and academics, typically pronounced in public by other intellectuals or academics, either tend to go over all too well or very badly. The suspicion of hypocrisy, or put more academically, Performative contradiction is also well established, but only rarely becomes the object of extended reflections. Less frequently encountered and apparently less plausible than the suspicion of ideological capture is the claim that intellectuals completely lack a voice. Instead, it tends to be assumed, whether self-critically or dismissively, that intellectual speech is privileged, authoritative, powerful. Another commonplace is the shop-worn and ossified vocabulary of theory and practice. Even when these terms go unmentioned, critique, to be worthy of the name, needs to reflect and perform, internalize and externalize the question of theory versus practice in its every twist and turn. The result does not take the form of a problem that is solved, nor does critical practice, however it's defined, provide a solid empirical basis for the general theory of the vast range of effects produced by the varied and heterogeneous forms of intellectual and academic speech. A narrower and more established line of theorization focuses on the psychology of the intelligentsia as a collective, singular, and distinctively modern social class. Such a class identity is familiar in anecdotal folk sociologies, for example, the idea of intellectuals as elites, but is notoriously difficult to pin down. Read as an inheritance of the Marxian theory of class, the intelligentsia is imagined in a supporting role in relation to the class consciousness of the proletariat. Outside of Marxist revolutionary thought, however, this same style of analysis is also very common, for example, in the observation that many electoral demographics seem to vote against their own economic interest. Another influential account defines the intelligentsia precisely as free-floating in relation to the forms of identification and identity politics that define other classes or social groups, and by which these groups also often define themselves. This idea is very intuitive within present-day understandings of intellectuals as socially disintegrated or integrated mostly in relation to other intellectuals. Such narratives also implicitly continue the story of the Enlightenment in the relation of individual uplift, Bildung, and broader social transformations. The progressive leaning of intellectuals is thus presupposed, but often only ends up in generalized and vague speculations about their role in society. Michel observes that under conditions of mass literacy and diversifying forms of intellectual labor, it becomes increasingly unclear who the intellectuals actually are, whether socially, institutionally, or according to their own self-definition. In modern societies, with extensive media and communications apparatuses, he contends, intellectuals are ultimately language workers, professional and unprofessional, paid and unpaid contributors to the streams and tributaries, backwaters and cesspools of this vast network. He further notes that the term intellectual is itself highly polarized, either strongly positive or negative in its connotations. And here comes another quote. As old as the concept of the intellectual is its two-sided character as a positive and negative shibboleth. An intellectual is always the other or its opposite, the other's other. The most stereotypical version of this difference, Michel suggests, is between bad intellectuals who are lackeys and functionaries of the apparatus, elites and ruling powers, and good intellectuals who are independent, critical, resistant, bold, and uncompromising. Such imaginations are familiar and not only one-dimensional. The tables are also easily turned as the groups and their supporters offer negative interpretations of the actions of the other. The heroes can easily become villains and vice versa. For Michel, this situation can be traced back to a dialectic that first emerged together with right-left politics in the wake of the French Revolution. It gave rise to the belief in conspiracy theories and the manipulation of public opinion on the one hand, and the appeal to silent majorities on the other. Widening out from these narrower but still quite vast formulations of the problem, the stakes belong to the philosophy of history and the theory of ideology. Now it is a question of intellectuals' leadership in steering the course of history, their fluctuating medial role as producers and consumers of ideology, their susceptibility to ideological narratives, their complicity in the production and reproduction of such narratives. The worry here, if one can call it that, is that rather than being uniquely able to think about the interest of the whole society, the whole world, intellectuals may unwittingly pursue more limited private interests, for example, in publishing books and articles, which may cause them to become victims of their own privilege. But as I initially noted, those thus ascribed with such false consciousnesses tend not to be very receptive to such an interpretation. The counter-accusation of anti-intellectualism is a potent one, which will probably also be the last word in such conversations. Despite these and many other challenges, the idea of my paper is to follow Karl Markus Michel and present the intellectual and the academic as others of modernity. Based on what I have already said, this may seem counterintuitive. Ariel also spoke about this in the introduction. And many influential accounts, even the materialist ones, also would seem to suggest the opposite whenever intellectuals, philosophers, scholars, academics, scientists, and critics are cast in leading roles as the producers of ideas, the orchestrators of action, the interpreters of the past, and the designers of the future. Michel's idea, however, to roughly sketch it here at the beginning, is that critical intellectuals were always out of step with the societies and political systems that hosted and sometimes tolerated them. As these systems became organized by an increasingly strict division of labor, intellectuals were viewed as superfluous and annoying, neither essential nor disruptive to the smooth reproduction of industrial capitalist states. Because the intellectuals continue to vent their frustration, primarily in writing, Michel's idea of speechlessness must be considered, I think, partly as metaphorical. He uses this idea of speechlessness, Sprachlosigkeit, to encompass the varied forms of alterity and political marginalization that can afflict intellectual and academic communication. Moving now to part 3, 68 to 88, Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? Because Karl Markus Michel and his theoretical writings of the 1950s and 60s are not very well known, I decided to devote a significant portion of my talk today to a theoretical classic, which I think will be much more familiar to many of you listening today or maybe later in the recording. Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? First published in 1988. It would not be an exaggeration to say that this text represents a turning point, maybe not for post-colonial theory itself, but certainly for its relation to different strands of French theory. The question posed in the title, Can the Subaltern Speak?, which Spivak consistently answers in the negative, may tend to overshadow the equally important question of the piece about whether intellectuals, theorists, and academics can speak, for whom they speak, and whether they are able to give an adequate account of the position from which they speak. Spivak's text, therefore, like Michel's, is a critique of intellectual speech and the politics of theory itself. Spivak, I want to say, addresses many of the same questions as Michel from the opposite end of a historical caesura, a 20-year gap, which one might call high postmodernism. Following roughly 2 decades of the ascendance of structuralism and post-structuralism, Spivak's question about the subaltern reactivates the legacy of Western Marxism. Exemplarily here, one could think about Georg Lukács and Franz Fanon, which had been the dominant framework of European leftism up to 1968. This context is clearly signaled by the title of the volume, Marxism and the Interpretation of Culture, in which Spivak's essay first appeared. In the essay, a Marxian framework is aligned with Derridian deconstruction to produce a far-reaching critique of the concept of representation. The crux of the title's question is an interrogation of the possibility of representation in the sense of Vertretung, of standing in or speaking for, and thus representing the interests of oppressed and silenced others. Spivak shows how the academic and non-academic intelligentsia consistently, perhaps inevitably, failed in their attempts at such a representation. These failures correspond to the limits or even the impossibility of revolutionary projects, which depend on representatives to speak for collectivities. Spivak thus breaks with the tradition of revolutionary Marxist thought and falls back to a more strictly intellectual and epistemic enterprise. She calls for, I quote, a developed theory of ideology, and a second quote, a practice of measuring silences. The intelligentsia, she suggests, can no longer be the cheerleader or vanguard of progressive or revolutionary action. Its speech has no direct outlet or political effectivity. Instead, the task of the intellectual is to gain critical access to the black box of consciousness and to critically reveal the silences that lie beneath the history of representations. These kinds of questions are what tie Spivak to Michel across the 20-year hiatus between 1968 and 1988. The project of Michel is Die sprachlose Intelligenz, however, differently from Spivak, is to retrace the extremely convoluted, roughly 200-year path that led to the political abdication of intellectual and academic speech. He writes, in other words, the extensive prehistory of the position to which Spivak will recur. Starting with Rousseau's Volonté Générale in relation to the French Revolution, arguably the locus classicus for the aporias of representation in the context of democracy and popular sovereignty, Michel lands in a present-day Germany in which intellectual autonomy and freedom come at the cost of hermeticism and isolation. The intellectuals are belated and historically out of sync, the last ones holding on to narratives of the kind that Spivak and Michel want to talk about. He writes toward the end of the third part of his essay, this belatedness is not only the result of the intellectuals' almost heroic insistence upon principles of liberal democracy and the means of liberal critique, or upon the theories of Marxism and their critical toolkit, which are all entirely beholden to the idea of political consciousness and political inclusion, with which the intellectual was long ago left alone. So the intellectuals are basically almost defined as a class which believes in this particular set of ideas. In the sentences that follow this quote, the self-attributed radicalism of the intellectual in relation to the questions of consciousness raising and ideology is, Michel suggests, itself traditional, outdated, and possibly conservative in relation to modern media technology and the accelerating transformation of society itself. His 1960s treatise on the Speechless Intelligentsia, and especially its third part from 1967, thus presents itself as the extended obituary of the ingrained ways of thinking about progressive politics and left intellectual activism. And yet, a clear alternative does not present itself. And the intellectual-centric mode of conceiving politics from which Michel seeks to depart or diagnoses a departure taking place remained very much alive at the time of writing and in his own intellectual approach. To the extent that he has a vision of what comes next, it seems to involve the integration of the left intelligentsia into, in the spirit of 1960s Habermas, what one might call left technocracy, or what was also called the Long March Through the Institutions. Spivak, on the other hand, is seeking to return, at least in part, despite the insurmountable problems of the representational model, to the history which, according to Michel's diagnosis, had already ended in failure and marginalization. Exemplary of the abandonment of the main line of left intellectualism for Spivak is a discussion between Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, published under the title Intellectuals and Power in 1972. A text which also arguably represents another kind of a version of the left technocracy model. Compared to Michel and Spivak, Foucault and Deleuze's conversation can only be described as theoretically weak, to the point of embarrassing. Spivak rightly singles it out for extensive criticism. What she objects to fundamentally is the way that the old questions about interest, consciousness, and ideology are subsumed into a monolithic idea of desire, which remains just as unknowable as political consciousness ever was, but which allows the French theorists to presuppose a political vector of revolution, as well as a symbiotic relation between intellectuals, especially Foucault and Deleuze themselves, and the oppressed and working classes. The interview thus stands in extreme contrast to the skepticism of Michel and Spivak on exactly these points. From their point of view, the interview exemplifies, or would exemplify, intellectual narcissism and a kind of post-68 euphoria, which declares the dilemmas of the relation of intellectuals and politics to be a thing of the past. I want to show you specifically how this looks. It's important insofar as the kind of mission-accomplished rhetoric one sees here not only informed the self-understanding of intellectuals post-68, but also played a role in later generations. Deleuze, for example, repeatedly alludes to the recent historical rupture in the use of the words "no longer." Possibly, he says in the interview, possibly we're in the process of experiencing a new relationship between theory and practice. A theorizing intellectual for us is no longer a subject, a representing or representative consciousness. Who speaks and acts? It is always a multiplicity, even within the person who speaks and acts. Representation no longer exists. There's only action, theoretical and practical action. By decentering the intellectual-centric worldview, leveling all hierarchies, conflating theory and practice, Deleuze is actually, so Spivak argues, recentering the intellectual as a real political power. Foucault responds in kind, seemingly in total agreement. In the most recent upheaval, the intellectual discovered that the masses no longer need him to gain knowledge. They know perfectly well without illusion. They know far better than he, and they are certainly capable of expressing themselves. The intellectual's role is no longer to place himself somewhat ahead and to the side in order to express the stifled truth of the collectivity. Relative to Michel, these proclamations are notable for their hyperbolic sense of post-historical temporality and a correspondingly uncomplicated relation of theory and practice, of discourse, language, and speech. The insistence on the automatic activation of intellectuals and their theories in the context of an ongoing revolution is an instance of belatedness in Michel's sense, a reenactment of the old tropes of revolution, a continued adherence to outdated models. Spivak also notes, somewhat obliquely, that Deleuze and Foucault, quote, continue a much older debate in the guise of a post-Marxist description of the scene of power. She attempts to take these claims seriously, possibly giving them more credit than they deserve, which leads her to view them as provincial, corresponding to the privileged position of European intellectuals in relation to a literate or even highly educated working class, in relation to a literate or even highly educated working class. She also argues scathingly, despite the rather abstract language, that such a short-circuiting of the possible connection between intellectuals and the oppressed, quote, has not been salutary, for counter-hegemonic ideological production, end quote. The point, I take it, is that we, academics and intellectuals, critics and theorists, make it too easy on ourselves if we assume that our intellectual production and political goodwill automatically translate themselves into progressive, right-thinking, and even revolutionary practices. Intellectuals' good faith in their own good intentions is a problem, she argues, because it leaves uncontested the dominant intellectual formation, which she characterizes not totally helpfully as the positivist empiricism that provides justification for, quote, advanced capitalist neocolonialism and the international division of labor, end quote. To attempt to gloss this a little, the empirical goals of economic development and increased productivity, combined with the discourses of enlightenment, education, and political uplift, give ideological cover to ongoing processes of colonial exploitation. And ultimately, imperialism is, I think, a word you find in there too. To conclude this section, my point is not to give Deleuze and Foucault a hard time. It is rather to suggest that texts like Michel's and Spivak's, which question the effectivity of intellectual speech and the speech of intellectuals, may be more the exception than the rule. It is simply easier to assume that critique, theory, and academic writing are ultimately consonant with the vector of one's own political ideas and intents. To this end, the unifying force of desire, highlighted by Foucault and Deleuze in place of interest, remains as a convenient black box. Both Michel and Spivak explicitly criticize conceptions of this kind, which they see as a reversion to class-free theories of mass psychology and mass hysteria that were influential in the lead up to fascism and in response to it. And that's Gustave Le Bon and Hermann Broch in the case of Michel, and Wilhelm Reich in the case of Spivak, who references Reich because he's referenced by Foucault and Deleuze. Moving on now to my final part, the end of ideology. Sorry, the quote doesn't actually match, so I'll just leave this slide up until I'm ready for that quote. In this slide, I will drop back another decade. Sorry, in this section, I will drop back another decade to May and June of 1957, when Michel, not yet 30 years old, presented a thesis on the end of ideology in Adorno's Frankfurt seminars. Even before these seminars were published in 2021 by De Gruyter, edited by Dirk Braunstein, Michel's referat seems to have had a semi-legendary status within the history and memory of the Frankfurt School. In 1999, Alex Demirovich's Der nonkonformistische Intellektuelle, the nonconformist intellectual, offered a reconstruction of Michel's thesis, and Morten Paul's 2022 book on the Surkamp Verlag quotes a letter from 1967 from Oskar Negt to Michel, in which the two renewed their acquaintance from Adorno's seminars a decade earlier. Negt writes, "Jedenfalls," sorry, I'll just read it in English. "In any case, your magnificent presentation on modern ideology remains vivid in my memory. Of course, authors tend to flatter series editors, but the published record of the seminar suggests that it was a memorable event. Adorno responded extensively to Michel's thesis, and the two exchanged in a back and forth that went across two sessions on May 28th and June 4th. I thought it was nice, since today is June 4th, that we have a little commemoration of that seminar. Horkheimer and Habermas also weighed in the discussions, with the latter notably taking the side of Michel. Why do I want to focus on this seminar, which you could say is even more obscure than the book, Die sprachlose Intelligenz, instead of working with Michel's published text? Especially if one reads Morten Paul's book, Die sprachlose Intelligenz is programmatic for Michel's overall outlook, and ranks highly in relation to other theoretical classics of the period. To try to explain why I made this decision to focus on the seminar, I offer a short-ish digression on die sprachlose Intelligenz to give you a little bit more characterization of what this book is like as a reading experience and why I'm not focusing on it today as my primary source. So Morton Powell quotes the following sentence as the central diagnosis of Michel's book. Language, the privilege of intellectuals, has become their world, and this world has become their ghetto. There are a lot of sentences that one could quote as the central thesis of the book. It's not necessarily easy to choose, but for me, the most representative statement of Michel's main concern might be found in the final sentences of the essay's second part. These are those sentences. The humane refuge of the intellectuals, their utopias and alternative languages are in any case not revolutionary. Through their idiosyncratic fixation on the existent, they contribute to its eternalization, to the blindness of society, to the powerlessness of the intellectuals, and the appearance of the inevitability, into the appearance of inevitability, which makes those processes to which they are speechless bystanders look uncontrollable, irrevocable, meta-human. This appearance is already compulsive, has already become a destiny. I can say more about this quote, but for now, I think what both quotes, the one, this one and that one, show is that Morton Powell is right in assessing this as a programmatic work. The programmatic claims are kind of scattered throughout, and that these claims also stand in a strong contrast to many of the better known theoretical works of the period in the kind of early 1960s in West Germany. Some of those books were listed on the earlier slide. Michel himself writes at the end of part 3, however, that his book lacks a program, and I would also try to explain what so to speak, the non-programmatic side of the text looks like. Even the striking title, I would argue, does not imply a specific thesis or claim as much as it opens up a question that will be pursued from many angles in the course of the 3 sections of the book. Die sprachlose Intelligenz, in other words, is an essay rather than an academic treatise. The book version may be short, it's a small paperback, but read in the original journal publication, the identical text comes across as compendious, circuitous, and long-winded. It is also a treasure trove of quotations which are not systematically integrated in the manner of a dissertation or academic work. Michel rather makes his ideas plausible by refracting them through others' ideas. His words float on the surface of a huge mass of things that others have said. Sources are often given after the reader has been confronted with long quotes, and then again in endnotes. Michel thus enters into dialogue with others' ideas in a way that emphasizes what is said more than who said it. The historicization of the cited material is also therefore correspondingly porous, emphasizing the ways in which the ideas of historical figures can seem surprisingly contemporary and then again require interpretive labor in order to bring out their specific historical index. This relative stability of the long-term matrix of Michel's topic also explains, I believe, why so much of the text reads as if it could have been written yesterday. Die sprachlose Intelligenz, I would argue, is and has been strangely resistant to history. This is indirectly supported by the fact that, as far as I can see, there were no big post-68 changes, developments, or revisions of Michel's theory or overall outlook. As a one-time self-synthesis, statement of position of one person's ideas. Die sprachlose Intelligenz is highly unusual within the theory canon. The entire theory and thesis are confined, one could say, to this one single book. Such a condensation was made possible, I would argue, by Michel's position at the margins of German language academia. He was under no professional or professorial pressure to extend his theory in new directions or to amplify the main claims in competition with other theories. Die sprachlose Intelligenz is thus an unusual kind of monolith, an unqualified first and last word. The publication in 3 installments during the turbulent 1960s, on the other hand, does seem to reflect internal changes within Michel's position. Each of the 3 parts has a different topic and a different intellectual agenda. The first, which hinges around the revolutionary years of 1789 and 1917, appears to be a response to Reinhard Koselleck's Critique and Crisis, and follows a similar itinerary from the side of primarily 19th century leftist and revolutionary thought. The second part focuses on the literary, artistic, and cultural spheres, which started out at the beginning of the 20th century with a project of conquering reality and ended up, in Michel's account, by retreating into language, into autonomy, l'art pour l'art, isolation, hermeticism, utopianism, a move which infected the intelligentsia as a whole, as Michel shows extensively in the second part. The end of the second part restages the theoretical debate between Adorno and Arnold Gehlen on the end of ideology and Gehlen's thesis on post-histoire, post-history. I say restages because the actual debate, because the debate actually took place in Münster at the 1962 Congress of the German Philosophical Society. Michel concludes that the practical difference between the positions of Adorno and Gehlen is minimal. On the one side is the obsolescence and disaffection of intellectuals, that's Gehlen, versus their utopian sheltering or wintering, Überwintern, in the face of an inhospitable society. That's based on Adorno and also some quotes from Marcuse. The third and final installment of Die sprachlose Intelligenz is in some ways the most difficult to characterize. It is entitled Bitter Pills and addresses the contemporary political moment, so 67, and the poor chances of revolutionary politics under the conditions of global capitalism and the Cold War. This section stands out for its consistent emphasis on the belatedness of intellectuals, which I mentioned already and we'll talk about more in a moment. The other focus of the third part, which I won't have time to talk about today, is a specific scenario of the end of ideology in which it becomes possible, as people started saying in the last few years, to say the quiet part out loud. For Michel, we are or were living through a historical tipping point when the status quo no longer needs to hide its true face. There is no longer any need for a veil of ideology, no need for a rationalizing and justifying function, no concern about false consciousness or naked hypocrisy. The superego pyramid, as he calls it at one point, upon which democracies depend, seems to be collapsing. This means that supporters of authoritarian and populist leaders are not deceived or disinformed. They are getting what they actually want. And here again, the shift can be observed in the sense of Foucault and Deleuze from a rational idea of interest into psychological dynamics of desire. I see I'm approaching the end. I think I can get through the rest in maybe 10 more minutes. I've offered a quick summary to explain why I decided not to talk primarily about Die sprachlose Intelligenz, and will now focus in my concluding pages on Michel's 1957 seminar presentation and discussion with Adorno and others. The reason basically is that in 57, Michel had a quite simple and strong thesis on the end of ideology, which he didn't completely depart from in Die sprachlose Intelligenz, but did massively complicate, deepen, and blur. Part of what changed is that by the 1960s, competing versions of the thesis were already in circulation. In Daniel Bell's influential 1960 study, The End of Ideology, and also in Gehlen's already mentioned idea of post-histoire, and to some extent also in the works of Adorno. Thus, the challenge was arguably less to present his own theory than to unfold the range of implications already contained in other theories. Die sprachlose Intelligenz, therefore, in comparison to the 1957 seminar presentation, is more of a meta-theory, less definitive and more multifaceted and speculative, harder to pin down and reconstruct. The claim in 1957, on the other hand, was relatively straightforward, and it is not difficult to understand why it would have made waves in the context of a theoretical milieu that takes its primary orientation from Marx. In order for class and class conflict to make sense, to produce a historical dialectic, there needs to be a tight, necessary correspondence between class, grounded in material conditions, and ideology through which these classes rationalize the conditions. Michel's idea of the end of ideology is thus not that ideologies cease to exist, but that they become unmoored from class identity, and indeed from other forms of group identity. In an increasingly leveled middle-class society, an idea propagated in the 1950s by Helmut Schelsky, there is nothing that prevents the working class from ascribing to bourgeois ideology or from arbitrarily adopting any other ideology. Michel's thesis is indirectly confirmed by the language of consumers and producers of ideology in a marketplace of ideas. One of the clearest descriptions of the situation is recounted in the summary of the June 4th seminar. I think I actually don't have a slide for the quote that I'm about to read, so I just read it in English. In the consumption of bourgeois ideology by all and sundry, Michel sees, on the one hand, that present-day society no longer produces any ideologies of its own, and on the other hand, that it can't completely do without ideologies, and for this reason, artificially keeps alive the ideologies of a past era. That's a quote, even though it's saying what Michel said, it's somebody else who wrote a summary of the seminar. The ideological matrix, which was supposed to have been held together as a system of indexical or quasi-natural science in relation to class or group identity, unmasks itself as an unpredictable and unending circulation of arbitrary science. This model, which does not admit the possibility of genuinely new ideologies, conceives the circulation of ideology as a process of recycling and recombining within a closed system. An extended view of this thesis is presented at the beginning of the May 27th session, and that's now the quote that you're actually looking at in the PowerPoint slide. The bearers of these traditional ideologies are clearly defined groups and strata within which the corresponding ideology itself remains continuously effectual. With the dissolution of the groups, the ideology also immediately collapses, but without disappearing completely. Instead, it releases the material for new ideologies. For this to happen, the detachment of the old ideology from its original collective bearer is in fact a strict requirement in order for the now autonomous ideology to get into line with the general process of circulation, which runs parallel to the process of the circulation of commodities. Thus, the presentation concluded that today there are no longer any ruling ideologies. The connection is made here between the end of ideology and the end of history. This does not mean that small h history does not continue in many ways. It means that without a collective subject of capital H history, which can be the carrier of its own ideology, it becomes impossible to conceive historical progress that could lead to an epoch fundamentally different from the current one, to an ideology that would have a necessary relation to consciousness. Michel's striking conception for this condition is luxurious false consciousness, as opposed to necessary false consciousness. In conclusion then, in the final page, I offer the four main points of his presentation, which he elaborates on in the 1957 seminar. First point, ideologies neutralize themselves to the degree to which homogeneous interest-based dispositions start to dissolve, or the interests themselves cease to be transparent. Two, neutralized ideologies are no longer defined as necessary false consciousness, but as luxurious false consciousness. Society becomes an ideology to itself through the duplication of that which exists in any case. The residues of emeritus ideologies, insofar as they are not useful as a sheer advertisement of the existent, serve as decoration of a societal condition in which the old ideologies are no longer necessarily required. I find the third point is the most difficult to understand, so let me try to explain it in a concluding speculative reading. If Michel's theory, let's go ahead and call it postmodern, seems intuitive or even unremarkable, I would argue that this is because it largely corresponds to the concept of ideology that we are already most familiar with, the one that became dominant in the last 50 years. The only thing that survives from the old concept of ideology then is the concept of ideology itself, which is, so to speak, the common denominator in the circulation of ideologies. In other words, after the end of ideology, all that remains of the old concept, in the context of the constant circulation and recycling and recombination of ideologies, is ideology as an ideological concept in the original sense. I'm not trying to be tricky or ironic here, and I also don't think it's novel to suggest that our time is characterized by a quasi-universal ideology of the universality of ideologies. Following Michel's argument about belatedness, the intellectual desire to hold on to the old meaning of necessary ideology and everything that goes along with it as a counter to and diagnostic of the new hegemony of luxurious ideologies would be nearly definitive of what it means to be an intellectual, of the conservatism of intellectuals as a class, of our inability to fully enter into a space of ideological warfare that doesn't actually speak to us as intellectuals. That's the end of my paper. I made it through, I hope, roughly in time without testing your patience too much. And now I'm going to switch back to see who's there.
Oh, we are here. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Wetters, for introducing us to the fascinating figure of Karl Markus Michel and his thesis on ideology, and for I hope you can hear me well.
You're frozen, but I can hear you.
Okay. So I was thanking you for introducing us to the figure of Karl Markus Michel and his thesis on ideology, and again for your thought-provoking discussion, which I think makes an important contribution to our lecture series, and it challenges the assumption of the critique, the intellectual as a privileged agent of modernity, and offers us a different and necessary framework for thinking about the figure of the critique or the intellectual as a subunit and occupying a double-edged position. And I think that the reframing you offer feels especially urgent, in today's political climate where knowledge and critical discourse are increasingly questioned and sidelined. So thank you for that. And we will now open the floor for questions. Please feel free to share your question, and if you can turn on the video, it will be even better. Yes, please. Christian, Spain?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation on this very weird material. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the path into the Kursbuch that you hinted at earlier in the presentation, and how how he conceives of the intellectual when he does these transfers from France to Germany. So how does this look in practice is basically my question.
Well, I only have maybe a little more to say about that, because the whole Kursbuch context is something that I still have to work on. It's always the problem with these kind of multi-volume, often quite long journal situations. And I also didn't really have a chance to refresh what I already knew about Kursbuch from the last time when you, Christian, were there when we talked about this text in December. But basically, so I keep it somewhat brief and simple. Kursbuch was like a pretty innovative publishing project with a lot of important figures and people who like became important associated with it in different phases. And it was, and maybe that seems a little paradoxical based on what or unexpected based on what I read and said today. It was also associated very strongly with the '68 student movement, or kind of came to be understood as a kind of a strongly left-leaning kind of, in a certain way, you could say like activist publication, or one that activists were reading. And I think partly what that says, at least in terms of like how to understand Michel, or how I understand him anyway, is as bleak and, so to speak, pessimistic as a lot of the textual material is. I think that in a certain way he writes this text from a standpoint of a kind of an optimism, or so to speak, an idea that intellectual and academic production isn't completely impossible in the 20th or the 21st century, but we have to like be tough on ourselves in thinking about what the actual obstacles are, and to try then to attempt to move in some different directions based on that like realism of the challenges that face intellectual and academic speech. And Kursbuch itself was in a way an example of that kind of publishing initiative, which had like literary and theoretical texts, wide range of different genres, and which had for itself a kind of a program which is represented in the title. Christian will know this because I emphasized it when we talked about it before. But for those who are not native speakers of German, one would imagine that the Kursbuch means course book. And in a certain way, it's okay to translate it that way, that the Kursbuch is a kind of it models itself in the public sphere on a kind of an academic knowledge, or kind of a course that the reader would have to give themselves by following what's going on in this journal. But the actual meaning of Kursbuch, which is, I think, these days not that well known, even maybe to native speakers, is that it was actually the big book you had to consult, which, if you wanted to find all the connections between all of the trains and public transportation systems of Europe. So it was a kind of a guidebook, or like a form of practical orientation, like how do we get from point A to point B? And so as much as there was a kind of an eclecticism and a kind of, I mean, really quite aggressive intellectualism, which you see also in the quoted material, associated with the Kursbuch culture. It also had this idea that it wanted to be a kind of a source book, or a conversation piece for political activism and for thinking about contemporary politics. And in that way, I think it offsets a little bit the kind of bleakness of some of these end of ideology theories and things like that.
Thank you for that. Do we have more questions? Oh yes, Professor Michal. Thank you.
Yes, Thank you so much. I've learned a lot. It's a bit far from my literary curiosity, but I was thinking throughout your talk about two things, basically just out of curiosity, why Michel did not complete his dissertation. Does it have to do with this concept of the academia, or in what sense it's played also a role if we look at it in a retrospective way with regard to his work? Also with regard to the concept of belatedness. Thinking about Adorno, how deep his understanding of psychoanalytical models, I was thinking about this belatedness also in terms not only of this linearity in time, but also something psychic, or so to say, almost like this Nachtragglichkeit. But here it's zu spät kommen. So I was wondering whether we can think about some kind of relationships within this concept. And finally, the thing of the dialectic of enlightenment, when you mentioned this end of ideology and the destiny in the end, I was thinking whether there is a kind of connection, or you can read it backwards also to this 47 work by Adorno and Horkheimer.
Thanks. Those are all really interesting questions. Some of them are questions for me too, so I just do my best to give you my sense of things at this early stage of the work. So there isn't an actual biography of Michel, and it's something I still have to track down, actually, is whatever biographical sources there are. I think one relatively easy thing, which I didn't get around to before the talk today, is to look at obituaries, which there will have been quite a number of them. Some of them are also quoted in sources that I'm working with, but I didn't yet take the step of going back to the obituaries to get a little bit more biographical detail. The other source is, of course, going to the archive, and I think a lot of, because he worked for Suhrkamp, then that means a lot of the writings and also letters that he did in a professional capacity are now archived as a part of the Suhrkamp archive, which is in Marbach. And so those are also sources that other scholars have started to work with, including one of the quotes from the letter to Michel today. And so I think that I mean, in terms of tracing out exactly, let's say, whether some of the theses that I had about Michel's development can actually be, so to speak, verified by or supported with more evidence from the biographical side, is definitely an interesting one. And I think partly what's interesting about it is one can test the degree of intentionality behind some of the things that I'm just more or less speculating on. I mean, for example, this idea that he imagined himself as a kind of an organic intellectual, rather than someone who is beholden to institutions, whether that is Suhrkamp or whether that's the university system. So I think that that's a place where there's probably a lot more material still to figure out. I mean, as with all life stories, one can imagine it's a mix of intentions and all other kinds of things that can happen to cause people not to finish their dissertations. And the last question, I think, ties into that too. From what I have read in other people's writing on Michel in the context of the Frankfurt School, I mean, basically, he knew a lot of these theorists' work from their own mouths. And also, though, seems to have basically read everything I think in many cases as it comes out. So die sprachlose Intelligenz typically is citing works by Adorno and Habermas and all other figures which are just like 1 or 2 years old. So he's like keeping up with the let's say the figure of Adorno's theory in the 1960s. And a lot of sources I've read, especially this is in the case of Habermas, will emphasize the dialectic of enlightenment and the work in exile of the 30s and 40s doesn't really become very well known until later. It's actually post 68, and in the context of 68, where the students go back to the earlier writings of their own teachers, and in many cases also find that the teachers are insufficiently radical in their politics compared to what they wrote in response to fascism. So it's like this changing context of the Cold War versus the reaction to the Nazis, basically, which becomes a kind of a lever for theoretical production on the one hand, but also generational conflict and activism on the other.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this very interesting, your interesting answers. And I was wondering, as you mentioned in the previous of a broader, larger project, the theory show, and I was wondering if you can share with us few, information about this work in progress, and which place does today's talk occupy in the larger framework of your.
Yeah, and I'm happy to say a little bit about that. So it's called the theory show partly from a kind of an intellectual motivation to try to look at theories in the condition of their emergence, you could say, and not through the kind of exegesis of theoretical classics in dialogue with other theoretical classics later on. So it's an attempt to I mean, a certain way you could say historicize theories, but also to see them as a form of work, a form of thought, which sometimes works better if we can look at the kind of spontaneous way in which these discourses are coming together, interacting with each other, and kind of occupying the same space, rather than, so to speak, as universal, which I think is one way that theory sometimes has been understood, is it's something like a philosophy or a universal statement, which is like portable and transportable. And I have nothing really against reading theory that way, but I think it's been more like the way of reading theories that I was also brought up into in a way. And it was then also a discovery in some sense that one can go back and look at the original publications, look at the conferences and congresses where things come out in, I would say, a way that's often a bit less monolithic, because you have the different theorists as figures interacting with each other, and also in the language, which, if I can put it like that, is a bit clearer and more to the point. There's a kind of, you could say, like an academicization that happens in the moment that a conference paper gets published in an academic journal or gets put into a book chapter of some kind. And so to get a little bit back into that, I mean, I realize there are, so to speak, certain potential methodological pitfalls with that too, but to get a bit back into the moment of spontaneity of theory production, also in a certain way as a genre of oral communication, and not just a genre of academic publishing. That's, you could say, the wider trajectory. And Michel emerged as an almost ideal figure for this kind of a question. And so that's why I kind of committed to working on this text almost sight unseen, because it seemed to fit really well with the kinds of stuff that I was working on. And he also, it comes up in passing in the paper, engages with one of these big philosophical conferences of the early 60s, the 1962 Münster Congress of the German Philosophical Society, which you could say is like itself the centerpiece of the book project. I'm looking at the lectures at that conference by Adorno, by Karl Löwit, by Hans Blumenberg, and as much as it's possible, kind of also trying to look into the archive and get behind what was published about that conference and find out what actually happened there, whether the published texts correspond to what was actually read. At least in one case, I have multiple drafts of Hans Blumenberg's conference paper to work with. And the draft, or the text that he read, is actually quite different than the one that was published. And so these are the kinds of things that I'm working with, really, as I'd call them, like my primary sources or corpus, to develop this kind of what I would feel, at least also for me, is a little bit more of an idea of theory which gives one a kind of a freer access to it, a more flexible and non-dogmatic approach to the ideas, because you don't see them as being presented as, so to speak, rules that you have to follow, but rather things that are presented in a dialogical and spontaneous and open-ended context, which gives one also as a reader or interpreter a lot more freedom to do things with them.
Okay, thank you. It seems like a project. I hope you would agree to give us more talk in the future on other upcoming chapters and parts of this project, which seems very interesting and important. And thank you for sharing this with us. And thank you for today. And I don't believe we have more questions at the moment. I hope. Okay, so thank you again, Professor Wetters, for today's lecture, and we will see you all on June 18th with a talk by Professor Michal Ben-Chorin, who is here with us today, and we'll talk about Ingeborg Bachmann and reading her in Israel. So thank you all, and have a great evening, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
That sounds really great. I hope to be there in 2 weeks, although there are two things at the same time that I maybe have to be there. But I mean, Bachmann belongs to this period that I'm working on.
Oh.
Two, of course. And in a way, also the circles around Frankfurt. So.
Wonderful. Yeah. So if not, we'll send you the.
Oh yeah, I can watch the video.
The video, exactly.
Yeah, that sounds great. All best to everyone in Haifa. I wish I could be there in person, but it was great speaking with you today.
Thank you. We hope next year to invite you all to join us in Haifa, and all best for you in Munich. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.